Lieutenant, CM'd. Blake Harrington didn't raise his voice so much as polish it until it gleamed. Ma'am Logistics observes from the back of the room, he said, chin tipping toward the far wall. We're running a live crisis block. Don't crowd the consoles. A few junior aviators chuckled, nervous, performative, the laughter of men unsure of themselves. The carrier's simulator control room was a low-lit amphitheater of phosphor glow and anxious breathing. On the primary wall, an F-35 Lightning II call sign Drift 5 rolled and twitched across a stormy HUD. In the corner, Ava Nolan, anonymous, in a plain contractor polo, and slacks, didn't react. She stood balanced and loose hands at her sides, eyes moving without obvious motion. She could have been waiting for a bus, or watching the weather, or to the one pair of eyes on the gallery rail that knew what it was, seeing quietly inventorying failure modes in the time it takes to inhale. Adam. Leonard Park leaned his elbows on the rail and watched her. The old habits crawled out of storage. How a real cockpit keeps its silence. How a good crew chief can diagnose by the sound of the pump. How a test pilot's shoulders never lie. Nolan's weren't slumped or rigid. They were settled like a rifle on sandbags. Harrington misread that stillness as emptiness. Park recognized it as bandwidth. On the big scope, a cascade of red ENG fail, GL, ENG fail RJN, bus off FLCS degraded. The sim's emergency inject had escalated to the worst possible combination. Total power loss driving degraded control loss. Ensign Riley Kim, one of their best stick and rudder students, rode the dive like a man on a greased handrail, every instinct screaming to pull every training block, whispering to wait. The room filled with overlapping commands. Harrington's voice cutting across the instructor. Pit power off, reset. No, damn it, reset failed. Kim nose down for energy. No level watch the alpha. Roll wings level. What began as direction became noise, and what began as training became a mess of cross purposes. Ava Nolan did nothing. Then she did one thing. She stepped forward to the comms panel at console 2, pressed transmit, and spoke in a low alto that somehow carried to every ear without being loud. Drift 5, this is Nolan. Acknowledge. The room blinked. Kim's reply wobbled and surprised and hoarse. Copy. Nolan, flaps 20. Let the nose fall to 5 degrees up. You're fast. Bleed to 180 knots. No roll inputs yet. Trim out the twitch. You're riding degraded laws. Treat it like a glider with an attitude problem. Harrington's mouth opened, then closed. Park watched him, then watched Nolan, then watched the scope. The simulated jet, which a moment ago had been an anvil with a helmet, began to behave. The absurdity of the orders flaps into a dead stick made sense when you remembered what flaps really buy. You drag for speed, control, lift for attitude, authority, a bigger, fatter wing when control laws go dumb. The dive shallowed. The descent rate fell out of the red. The horizon bar stopped behaving like a metronome. Ease the right rudder. Nolan said conversational, as if reminding a neighbor to grab their mail. Crosswinds pushing your nose. There, hold 5 up. Count it with me, 1, 2, 3. Now alt select a field elevation, aim for the numbers, not the piano keys. You'll land long if you chase the flare too early. Harrington, to his credit, stopped talking. You could see him measuring his ego against a more pressing variable, the student's life inside that sim. Technicians froze headsets, half off, half on. The junior aviators who, moments earlier, had snickered about polo shirts and paper clips stood absolutely still. 3 miles, Nolan said. Your high good traded for speed. 185, 180. Hold it. No more altitude in the bank after the fence. Attitude's your currency. The runway numbers grew large and white and urgent. Now, Nolan said, and her now felt like a metronome click. You couldn't argue with, begin your flare, tiny touch. Hold the attitude, let the sink eat the speed. The tires met the runway with a shriek that shook the speakers. White smoke rolled across the screen, and Drift 5 skated straight, decelerating hard, wobbling once as the control laws figured out who they wanted to be when they grew up. The jet stopped just shy of the overrun. The red on the scope blinked to amber, then to black. The alarms died. Silence is a chimera. It eats the noise and leaves the meaning behind. In the control room, it landed like a third body in the room. Harrington's hands hovered over his console, forgotten. Kim's breathing crackled over the speakers loud because it was the only sound. A tech whispered without intending to, "Holy." Admiral Park straightened and let the quiet do its work. In that pocket of still air, the room rearranged itself around a new center of gravity. Not the rank tabs, not the title on the schedule block, but the person who had spoken 6 sentences and changed the outcome. It would have been enough to thank her. Harrington might have done that if habit hadn't gotten there first. Authority often tries to reassert itself after a scare. He pivoted toward Nolan, found a way to make an order sound like an apology, and reached for procedure. "Ma'am-based policy contractors in secure bays, please roll up your sleeves for identification." It should have been petty. It was. Nolan didn't bristle. She obliged, a slow, unhurried turn of cotton to elbow. What emerged was not a novelty sleeve. It was a history book. Ink faded and clean, a stylized trident that wasn't a trident, a 3-headed dog that wasn't a mascot, an undersit hydra, Echo 7. A handful of the oldest chiefs in the room sucked in air in perfect involuntary unison. Park came down the stairs fast enough to make the steps hum. He didn't speak to Harrington. He didn't speak to anyone. He went straight to the master terminal, keyed in a code no one else in the room had ever seen, and slotted an ID in a port that most systems didn't even display on the diagram. The screen didn't bring up the usual base personnel page. It went black, then built a new interface in white and steel blue headers that read restricted, flag access, black program. The file that resolved wasn't long. It didn't have to be. Nolan AVAM, status retired USN, recalled under contract. Former billet test pilot project Hydra, Echo 7. Specialty envelope expansion. Emergency procedures development. High-risk catastrophic failure regimes. Decorations Air Medal with V. Distinguished Flying Cross Legion of Merit. Call sign NYX. Park didn't glance around to confirm whether anyone else understood. He simply drew himself up, heels together, and rendered a slow, perfect salute. It wasn't showy because real respect never is. It was deliberate enough that the room had time to absorb the frame, a flag officer saluting a woman in a polo shirt who had just talked a kid out of a smoking hole in a virtual runway. Harrington swallowed and followed suit, the crispness of his salute more apology than pride. Ensign Kim, still strapped into the sim, raised a trembling hand toward the canopy camera like a man reaching out to touch something he didn't believe in 230 seconds ago. Nolan returned the gesture with the smallest possible nod. It was nothing. It was everything. Park cleared his throat, the gravel in it louder than the klaxon had been. "For the record," he said, "Hydra made our manuals honest. We told pilots what should work. They proved what did. There were 7 of them. We thought all 7 were gone." He let the words sit. No adjectives. No trumpet flourishes. Plain like the truth. If all the story did was end there, the base would have been different the next morning anyway. But the point of a lesson is to make it portable. Park made it policy before the coffee cooled. By 0700, the Simbay wasn't the Simbay. No signage changed, but everyone used the new name without being told Nick's terminal. The first item in every emergency syllabus was a 3-minute, 11-second file labeled Nolan loss of thrust control law fail. The technicians added timestamps and overlays so students could track energy, state against attitude cues as Nolan's voice paced them through. No one scribbled during the playback. Pens stayed down. People listened because the cadence told them what they needed to be, not just what they needed to do. Harrington changed faster than anyone expected. He didn't issue a memo titled Humility. He took the still frame from the replay the exact moment the dive became a glide and taped it above his console. Under it, he wrote 4 words in block letters with a thin black pen: "Calm buys time. Results matter." When rookies asked him, eyes wide, how to recognize real authority in a room full of rank and noise, he pointed to the audio waveform of Nolan's voice and said, "See how it never spikes? That's what you're buying when you train right. Not volume or raw, clarity." Park didn't stage a ceremony either. He walked the bay with a mug and watched people work. He listened for the new sound. It's hard to describe if you haven't lived in rooms like this your whole life, how knowledge has a hum and bravado has a rattle. The rattle was softer. The hum was louder. Ensign Kim asked to see Nolan 2 days later, clutching something small in his palm. It was his first solo patch. He held it out like an offering. "Ma'am," he said, "she didn't give speeches." She tucked the patch into the front pocket of her polo and nodded once. For a kid that young, it might as well have been an anointing. If institutions are organisms, they digest stories for fuel. The base ate this one and found it nourishing. The young officers who had laughed at the logistics clerk rewrote their mental checklists. The chiefs polished their cynicism until it reflected better things. And Harrington, who had polished arrogance into a leadership style, began asking questions before he gave orders. His voice lost an octave of performative confidence and gained one of actual authority. On the far wall of the ready room, right under the squadron pennant, and the framed portrait of a long-dead admiral with a mustache like a capital letter, someone pinned a printed screenshot, the F-35 squared on the centerline tires, smoking landing lights, bright as teeth. Beneath it in block Sharpie, someone wrote, "Calm is a superpower." The first time Harrington caught himself quoting Nolan without knowing he'd memorized her, it was a small emergency, just a hydraulics module throwing a tantrum during a high crosswind approach. His student's breath went noisy on the ramp. Harrington leaned into the mic and said, "Easy on the rudder. You're letting the wind live in your head. 5 up on the nose. Count it with me." The landing was ugly, but honest. On debrief, he didn't tell the kid he'd stolen the lines. He told him where he'd learned the trick of breathing before correcting. "You can't think with your heart rate on fire," he said. "Buy yourself 10 seconds, then fly." Adme Park wrote one memo only, and it wasn't about Nolan. It was about all the Nolans you never spot until the room is on fire. The directive was titled, not poetically but usefully, "The Dangers of Superficial Assessment." It described a nameless contractor who had executed an Omega-level intervention during a training failure. It asked a simple question: what cues did we miss before we needed her? And it proposed a simple answer: judge competence by behavior under load, not by age, wardrobe, or how loudly someone talks when the clock isn't running. Culture doesn't pivot on a dime, it arcs, but you can feel when the arc has a vector. Over weeks, the swagger bled out of the chatter in the ready room. Flight leads began opening briefs with checklists instead of war stories. Maintenance chiefs started asking junior airmen what their hands were telling them before their mouths tried to get a word in. Debriefs got quieter, better, meaner in the right way, meaner as in more honest, less performative. They cut the theatrics and left the truth. People asked Park what impressed him most about the day Nolan walked through Nick's terminal in a polo shirt and changed how a base thought about itself. He never pointed to the salute. He pointed to a smaller stranger artifact, the way the air felt in the room after the alarms died. "That's the sound of a standard reasserting itself," he'd say. "We all knew how we're supposed to behave. We just forgot." She reminded us. Years from now, when the current crop of junior aviators has gray at the temples and knees that complain about cold fronts, they'll tell the story badly and well. They'll get the model number wrong, sometimes F-35, F-18. It won't matter. They'll inflate the altitude and lower the fuel count. They'll turn the 3-headed dog into something fiercer and the Echo 7 into a thing with a music cue. They'll pin a little too much magic to the name Nix because that's what people do when they're grateful for help they can't explain. But the parts they'll get right are the only parts that matter. They'll remember that the voice didn't get louder, it got clearer. They'll remember that calm isn't the absence of fear. It's a practice, a discipline, a thing you do on purpose so other people can live. They'll remember a woman in a polo shirt whose shoulders didn't lie, whose hands moved only when they had to, who bought a kid 10 seconds and then spent those seconds giving him a way out. And they'll remember the taste of their own humility, sharp and clean like metal on the tongue, the good kind that makes you a better version of your rank. Harrington used to think legacy was a plaque or a call sign etched into a patch. After Nix, he learned it's quieter than that. Legacy is the way a room sounds when the right person speaks exactly as much as necessary. It's the hand that stays steady at 5 degrees nose up because someone taught you how to breathe. It's the culture that lifts its eyes from appearances and looks at outcomes. It's how you learn finally to tell the difference between volume and authority. The day the sign outside the simulator complex got repainted for ordinary reasons maintenance. That's all the base kept its unofficial name anyway. People met there and said, "I'll see you at Nick's," and everyone knew what was meant. Bring your best self, your quiet self, your checklist, your humility. On the first morning of every new class, Harrington stood in the doorway and watched the kids file in jittery and trying not to show it. He'd tap the corner of the stereo with a knuckle, and the room would settle into Nolan's 3 minutes and 11 seconds flaps 2-0 bleed to 180 easy on the rudder. An invocation that wasn't mystical, but worked like one. Admiral Park kept one artifact on his desk away from the awards. It wasn't the file. It wasn't even a patch. It was a yellow sticky note with a timestamp and 3 words scratched in his own crabbed old pilot hand. By 10 seconds. The rest is pilot work. And Ava Nolan. She never moved into an office or hung a shingle. She finished her contract and left as quietly as she'd entered, calling Park only once to thank him for not letting the pageantry swallow the point. Somewhere else in a different bay with a different problem and a different set of eyebrows arched in skepticism, she did what she has always done, make panic optional. If you were there that day, you don't need a plaque to remember. If you weren't, you have the audio. Either way, the math is the same. Calm buys time. Time buys options. Options, taken in sequence by steady hands, become survival. On a long enough runway, real or simulated, that's all any of us are ever doing. We're holding 5 up, trimming the twitch, and trusting the quiet voice that tells us the next right thing.